Welcome to the Dynamics of Abuse presentational series, Part 3, The Dynamics of Abuse, written and hosted by child abuse survivor and advocate coach, Lisa L. Beaudoin. Copyright 2017 by Lisa L. Beaudoin, all rights reserved. All theories, analogies, and most therapies discussed within this video presentational series are created by Lisa L. Beaudoin and are protected under strict United States laws. Source disclosure. While Lisa has copyright ownership of her theories, analogies, and most therapies that she presents, Lisa is not the owner of the sourced information that is sometimes used in her presentations. But in all cases, Lisa is grateful and gives attribution due as appropriate, with citation credited at times on the bottom of the slide where a specific source is referenced, in the credits at the end of the video, and in the description below dependent upon space. For any source to object to her use, please contact Lisa by email in the About section of this channel. Viewer content warning. This presentation contains topics such as abuse and violent and sexual behaviors. Therefore, viewer discretion is advised. This video session is part 3 of a 6-part series on a theory that I've created solely on my experiences of how I believe abuse starts and continues, as well as how I think we can stop and even prevent it. In this session, session 3, we're finally going to be discussing the actual theory that I have on the dynamics of abuse, which is coming from a viewpoint of a person who's been abused and is so simplistic, it's not difficult to understand at all. Before we go any further, please understand that I'm not the doctor or the counselor or the therapist. I'm the survivor of child abuse, the patient. It also means that as a patient, in no way am I recommending that what I discuss here in these videos replace any medical instruction or therapies that you currently have or will have in the future. As we advance through each slide, you'll see the menu topics located on the far left side of the slide. And finally, I've always recommended that you have a 3-ring binder and some loose leaf paper. The reason being is that I'm leading up to suggesting to you to create what I call a playbook, but at the least, just have some paper and a pencil or pen, and then eventually you can build a playbook of your own. And so now on to the dynamics of abuse. But before we begin, I'd like to explain how I came up with this theory just a little bit further. When I was little, aside from the hardship of abuse that I faced from my mother, or even maybe because of it, I'd often wake up in the middle of the night after having some horrific nightmares. And even now, I can remember most of them, which they were all mostly about tornadoes. Tornadoes that would come with the sounds and the noises that seemed so real, I would wake up with my heart pounding. So, do you remember when I talked about myself in session 1? And at the end of the video, I said that I realized there were parents who hadn't abused their children, and I wondered why they hadn't abused their children, and yet my parents had abused me? Well, somehow a correlation between the thought of tornadoes and that thought came to my mind. Because oftentimes, when I thought for sure there'd be a tornado in some of the storms that I've been in, there wasn't. And then there were tornadoes in some storms that I didn't think there would be. Well, this is how I came up with the dynamics of abuse. And so, just like child abuse, I found through research that variables that give rise to one tornado may not be always exactly the same for the other, but they do have some specific conditions or dynamics in common. So first, let's go through the dynamics needed for a tornado to form so that we can later see the correlation between the dynamics of a tornado and the dynamics of abuse. And so in the tornado, the first dynamic that's needed is the storm has to be what's called a supercell storm, which is usually at least 50,000 feet in height, with high force winds, giant hailstones, and enormous amounts of rain and lightning. The next dynamic is rising air, which is the cloud releasing heat that makes upward drafts of air. Now, moisture is also a main component that creates a huge cloud base. This is what can develop into a vortex, or sometimes it's called a mesocyclone. And this moisture is a lot of what a tornado feeds off during and in its processes. All this is followed by the third dynamic, which are rear flank downdrafts. These downdrafts create a temperature difference between the air inside the vortex versus outside, which builds up instability but also force as the cool, dry, seeking air wraps around the back of the vortex, pulling it down to create a funnel cloud. The fourth dynamic is if the funnel of air moves down into the moist cloud base, it is then pulled in and turns it into a rotating wall of cloud, forming a link between the storm and the ground, and a tornado touchdown occurs. The fifth dynamic is all the four dynamics holding it together using momentum or force to continue the tornado's devastating path. So, in summary, a tornado is produced when the right conditions or dynamics are met. However, once any of the dynamics dissipate, so too does the tornado. But just as important for us to see is if any of the four dynamics do not occur, well, then there is no tornado. It can never form. And so with this understanding, we can take that dynamic structure of a tornado and instead use it to create a model for the dynamic of abuse, which these dynamics then are basically referencing the possible mindset or the impulses of the mindset of a violator. So breaking down the dynamics, the first dynamic would be the violator's predisposition, which is the storm. But really, at this point, that violator is what we'll call a subject, as they're the person that will act upon and create the abuse, but they haven't as yet. The second dynamic is then the abusive roles, the roles that all of us have during an abusive situation, especially when it comes to the person who is targeted, who will eventually become the victim, is put into the path of this subject, thus creating the vortex. Now, it is my belief that the abusive roles create momentum for the third dynamic, the subject's affirmations, which is a part of the subject's delusion. That once the subject sees that there's a target in place, that this is a part of that affirmation, that the opportunity to play out their delusion with other variables encourages that delusion to continue. So then the subject will use the fourth dynamic, grooming tools, on that target until the abuse occurs. That is when the subject becomes a violator and they have acted upon their delusion and, sadly, that the target has become a victim. Now, I call the formation of all these dynamics as they build the violator's delusional circle, that somewhere there was a thought that drove this tornadic mindset of abuse, and that due to their predisposition and each of the dynamics falling into place, this causes the delusion to grow progressively within their minds. It has cemented the thought at the time of their act of abuse, that it's within their right to do so, and thus using their delusional grooming tools on the target and anyone else to believe that what they're doing is within their right to do. And as in a tornado, the abuse gains momentum as all the dynamics are now intertwined, creating the delusion to build stronger within the mindset of the violator. So now the violator will use dynamic number 5, which are the grounding tools to continue the abuse. So just in review, the dynamics for a tornadic expression of abuse would be dynamic number 1, the subject's predisposition and delusional beliefs, followed by the abusive roles. This is the second dynamic and the vortex. Next comes the delusional affirmations, to which the abusive roles are a part of that dynamic. This is followed by the subject progressing into the fourth dynamic, using variable grooming tools on a target and any potential witnesses until the abuse occurs. And then once the abuse occurs, the target is now a victim and the subject is a violator with potential witnesses as well. For the fifth dynamic, the abuse itself can also be considered an affirmation to the violator. The situation only escalates the delusion. So now the violator will use variable grounding tools so that they can continue the abuse for as long as they can. This can happen with possible witnesses that are present that cannot or will not break this violator's delusion. And if there are bystanders close enough that are unknowingly a part of that situation, that may also be a part of that affirmation to the violator. In other words, if the violator feels that they're getting away with the abusive act, this can also produce a building emotional affirmation in itself, which will further escalate the violator's delusional beliefs and their grounding tools, with a conviction in their mindset that what they're doing is perfectly okay and justified and within their right to do so. So now let's take a look at each dynamic a little bit further. But as we review, please picture them with me in two lines of sight. First, as if we're on the ground as we watch the tornado form from a distance, and then as if we're above the storm, watching the dynamics take shape. Let's start with the first dynamic, the subject's predisposition. This is the question usually asked after abuse has happened of, how could this person have abused this child? And these are where the predisposition variables or the reasons why of the subject are produced, with potential storms or reasoning due to their history. After many years of research, here are some of the reasons that I came up with. But the idea behind this presentation is for you to also think about this and ask these questions. So as hard as it is, can you think of any reasons why someone would abuse a child? The next dynamic we find in the dynamics of abuse are the abusive roles. Now, these abusive roles are the roles that people are shaped into in the mindset of a subject prior to or while abuse is taking place after they've become a violator. So this is where the vortex of the tornado of abuse starts to take shape. And some might believe that the target, or after the abuse, the victim, would be in the center of this dynamic. But the reality is, without a subject who will become a violator, there'd be no abuse. So we start with the subject who is in the center of our vortex, followed by the target, who is the one who will be abused. Next comes the witness or witnesses who will end up seeing the abuse take place, followed by the bystanders who are just outside of that inner circle, who will not see the abuse itself, but could potentially see it or even get a feeling that abuse is taking place. Then we have professionals in fields such as healthcare providers, teachers, counselors, and therapists, and then law enforcement, which are the police, followed by governing authorities. Now, these are the people who work on and administer state and federal laws like the CAPTA Act and Child Protective Services, while the police are the ones who enforce those laws. And then finally, we have the rest of society, people who are not in any direct association with the abuse that's taken place, but do have opinions of abuse based on their own beliefs, the media, and the current laws that we have in place. So now, looking at this dynamic of abuse from this vantage point, you can definitely see how abuse begins to form, much the same as a storm and a vortex of a tornado. Before we go on to the next dynamic, let's take a look at this delusional circle that I talked about earlier, which is where the direct act of abuse is taking place. And let's touch base on each of the definitions of those abusive roles. With respect to the definition of a victim, that a victim is a person who is deceived or cheated, as by his or her own emotions or ignorance, by the dishonesty of others, or by some impersonal agency, or of a misplaced confidence, of a swindler, of an optical illusion, but also too, instead of an optical illusion, a mental delusion of someone else's false belief. The witness is someone who personally sees the abuse, but may or may not come forward, depending upon their own experiences and beliefs, along with the pressure of some of the grooming and grounding tools that will be used by the subject who turns into the violator in this particular situation. The first type of witness is a non-victim, someone who is not a target, such as a spouse or another family member or a friend, or even another child who has not been abused as yet by this person. The second type of witness is a victim themselves, someone who is or has suffered from child abuse, either by this subject or someone else. An important thing to note here is that if this is the case, then at the time of their abuse, they weren't the witness, they were the victim. In other words, each subject and each victim has their own tornadic expression. The last type of witness is another subject, or even a violator, which means they've already acted out child abuse on some child. This type of witness is extremely dangerous as they're not only enabling the potential abuse, but due to their own delusions of thinking child abuse should be permitted, are most probably causing increased affirmation within the subject that makes this delusion have more force. But if acting out abuse on the target, again, another tornadic of abuse expression is formed. In other words, there can be many tornadoes of abuse per violator, each one with a different victim. And then we have the definition of the word violator. And the reason I use the word violator versus the more common word perpetrator is because while a perpetrator commits, that is only half of the equation. with the other half being that they have disrespectfully infringed and rudely disturbed the very healthy innocence which is part of the growth process of every single child, and left in its wake immediate pain and suffering that, if not dealt with, can create a lifetime of damage. Now we move on to dynamic 3, which are the subject's affirmations. These affirmations continue to shape the mindset of the subject that makes them feel justified in their thinking, that what they're thinking about doing or acting upon, even if it is a violation on a child, is something that they can or should do, or they cannot help themselves to do. And because the abusive rules are already put in place, that they have a target in mind to act upon, these thoughts then cement or affirm more firmly into the mindset of this subject, along with other affirmations, which can be many different things, many variables, such as anger, established opinions, distorted memories, excitable or pleasurable impulses that they can't seem to control, or addictions of all different types. And now, as you look at this vortex that's being pulled down into a funnel cloud, all these beliefs of the violator are due to what would be deemed as very unhealthy thoughts. And if thoughts are unhealthy, then so too are the actions that come from them. Actions that a subject believes and has convinced themselves that what they are about to do is justified, or even that it is meant to be done, no matter how immoral, unethical, or unlawful those actions might be. Once dynamic 3 has been reached, where the subject has a target and the affirmations have gained enough momentum, dynamic number 4 takes place, and the subject will now use grooming tools on their target and possible witnesses, which the grooming tools used on witnesses are sometimes and usually not the same as that used on a target. These grooming tools, which can be many different things being used, are again variables. Now, here are just some of the grooming tools that I've researched, which are not necessarily in order. But just like the rest of the dynamics of abuse, these tools are used in a tornadic movement, with the actions being built upon the weight or momentum of that movement of delusion in order to meet the needs of the violator. But in the cases of child abuse, all grooming tools are meant to do one thing, and that is to coax a child and anyone around them that could be a potential witness into succumbing to that subject's delusional beliefs. Until the abuse has actually taken place, the grooming tools will continue until, sadly, the tornado will touch down, which means the abuse has occurred. Now, the subject is a violator and the target is a victim. And with that action, the violator will feel the need to use the last dynamic, dynamic number 5, which are the violator grounding tools. These tools have an underpin of affirmation to them, and much the same as a tornado making its path of destruction on the ground, this last dynamic is used by the violator to keep the delusion of abuse going for as long as possible. Once the act of child abuse has been acted out by the violator, the goal of that violator is to continue the abuse, to continue the delusion that they've created and to keep it going. So the phrases and actions that they will now use are to help sustain that delusion with the victim and the witnesses. But it's also all their actions and phrases that again are affirmations to that violator, coaxing them as well as anyone else that becomes involved in this delusion. And where that affirmation creates that momentum of abuse, secrecy is much like the moisture in the cloud base prior to the tornado, but also needed to create the tornado and to sustain it. So now it should be fairly easy to see that these two actions, the affirmations and the secrecy, combine together to create the momentum and the force and are at the very core of the delusion that is used by the violator in the dynamics of abuse. And so when the delusional belief combines and grows within these dynamics in this tornadic abusive situation, again, we get what I call the violator's delusional circle. This is where the violator has wrapped their delusion around the victim and the witnesses using whatever tools that they have thought of or are available for the abuse to continue. With this understanding, we can then clearly see why it's so difficult for anyone within this delusional circle to break free of it, as they've all been pulled into this delusion, with delusional beliefs that are enforced, sometimes through great fear, sometimes due to loyalty, or even factors of love towards the violator. But all these factors are the many variables that are used within the patterns of these dynamics. And so by taking a closer look at this delusional circle, we should also understand that just like a real tornado, this tornado of abuse has its own cycle of evolution. It can evolve in whatever manner of time that it needs to, but once the abusive rules are in place, it usually happens very quickly and at times strengthens or weakens depending upon those factors and those dynamic patterns, because there is always a tornadic movement within the patterns. And so just to quickly recap on the 5 dynamics of abuse. Dynamic number 1 is the subject's predisposition along with the buildup of their delusional beliefs, which is the storm. This is followed by the second dynamic, the abusive roles that take shape, which creates the vortex. Once those abusive roles are in place, the target is there for the subject. The delusion will increase within that subject's mind with different variables, including affirmations, to which the abusive roles are a part of that dynamic. As the subject progresses, they will use the fourth dynamic, variable grooming tools on a target and any potential witnesses and even bystanders until the abuse occurs. Sadly, once the abuse occurs, the target is a victim, the subject is a violator, and that violator will now use grounding variables that will also include affirmations to continue the abuse. So, with all this information, understanding, and awareness, the questions now are, how then can we stop child abuse, but also, how can we prevent child abuse from occurring in the first place? Well, I believe that this presentation is a part of that, not only bringing awareness, but also some direction in understanding how abuse forms and continues so that we can stop and prevent it. So as we come to the ending of this presentation was created by me for you, whoever you are, to take the time to focus on the subject of child abuse, to research the laws, the statistical information and expert opinions, the advocates, as well as the survivor stories like mine, and the dynamics of abuse theory that I have, as well as other theories on abuse. Get to know as much as you can so that you can be proactively brainstorming with you and your family, including your children, on ways to protect them. Now, usually I suggest to you to go out and do your own research, and I still suggest that. But included in that suggestion, here are a few key points on possible discussions and thoughts that are based on my own personal experiences and research, which you can also add to your playbook or your parenting playbook plan. Because the sad fact is, statistically, hundreds of thousands of children are abused every single year in many different ways. Some mentally and physically, some sexually, and some fatally. Some are abused by strangers, but some are abused by people they know, even their guardians, and sometimes a relative. So by understanding the dynamics of abuse, we can start to combat all types of child abuse in many different ways. So please, take the time to really think about what I presented here. Also, make sure that you stop the video on this slide as well and jot down my 5 ways in 5 days that we can all help prevent child abuse. And if anything, do at least some of these things with your family. And always remember that secrecy is at the very core of child abuse and why we need to have open talks and dialogue between our children, our family, and those we love. This concludes session 3 of 6 on the dynamics of abuse. Please find the link below to watch session 4 to continue with this presentation. Thank you.